Our next speaker is Sarah Emanuel, who is Assistant Professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. She specializes in the Jewish origins of the early Jesus movement, ancient Jewish-Christian encounters, and the relationship between the Bible and literary and cultural studies. She is the author of 2 books, Humor, Resistance, and Jewish Cultural Persistence in the Book of Revelation, and Trauma Theory, Trauma Story, and Narration of Biblical Studies in the World of Trauma. Her 3rd book, Wrestling with Paul, the Apostle, His Readers, and the Fate of Jews, is expected in late summer 2025. Professor Emanuel, please welcome Professor Emanuel. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I have no PowerPoint to accompany this paper. I apologize. The last time I timed this, it came out to exactly 25 minutes, which really stresses me out. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. The Book of Esther is a book of excess. The story begins with a 180-day display of wealth, followed by a 7-day drinking party, followed by King Ahasuerus issuing a decree that men rule, followed by the emasculinizations of such men, followed by the reversal of a death plot, followed by an inglorious bastards-like slaying of roughly 75,000 people over the span of a 2-day sword fest. There's so much going on in the story that not only do scholars disagree over its intended meaning, but also its intended genre. The purpose of this paper is to think about the potential overlaps of genre as part of its excess storytelling in a way that speaks to the author's Jewish experience in the ancient Iranian world. Trauma is the foil of this paper, so I will start by unpacking its theory, which will then be followed by how the genres of humor and horror interact with it and with Esther in ancient context. I will then discuss briefly how these interactions make it difficult to read the Megillah solely within the ancient world. So if I had to use one word to describe trauma theory, it would be paradoxical. On the one hand, trauma is often defined as that which is unnarratable. To use the words of psychiatrist Judith Herman, traumatic events are such, quote, violations of the personal or social compact that they become unspeakable, end quote. Because there is no story with which to compare it, no language with which to describe it, and no means by which to absorb it, trauma often resists assimilating into narrative, whether personal or otherwise. On the other hand, such shattering linguistics effects of trauma do not necessarily end in the total, immutable deconstruction of one's personal or collective consciousness. The brain can often become possessed by the traumatic image or event, hitting the traumatized belatedly and unexpectedly via flashbacks, nightmares, hallucinations, numbing, enactments, hypervigilance, compulsive behavior, and other disruptive experiences. This leads theorists to conclude that, quote, traumatic symptoms have a tendency to become disconnected from their source and to take on a life of their own. Recovery, therefore, is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections, end quote. This means putting words to the flashbacks, to the dreams, hallucinations, enactments, or other unsettling thoughts and actions that haunt the traumatized. By putting words to these experiences, survivors are given a vehicle by which to create a narrative, offering them the opportunity to both process the event itself and construct newly integrated self-states, or newly constructed versions of a communal self. In sum, by naming, shaping, and giving words to traumatic experiences, storytelling becomes an act of processing, an act that seeks to make sense of and survive the many haunting associations and dissociations that, paradoxically, signify events which exceed categorized signification. Such narrativized processing need not solely describe the trauma proper either. In context of imperial-imposed trauma, for example, storytelling can offer a way to lament and even talk back. That is, to counter the dominant transcripts that have deemed certain bodies, certain voices, and certain minds other than. This is not a one-and-done process. Trauma stories require retellings, and not just 1 or 2 or 3. For many, it takes a lifetime of rewriting one's trauma narrative and countering oppressive social transcripts, as new experiences conjure new ways of remembering, reflecting, and conceptualizing. Trauma, put simply, is not linear. It is deeply contextual, yet memories and feelings of the contextual event or events attach elsewhere. The trauma begs to be processed, and in that begging, it haunts the traumatized through jarring and sometimes seemingly incomprehensible connections. This haunting can even lead to a perpetual cycle of re-traumatization, where the past continues to repeat itself or haunt in the present. Sometimes, and especially in contexts of communal suffering, the trauma hasn't even ended when narrative claims have started to be made. Thus, trauma is, if I had to use a second word, exhausting. Finally, as much as the effects of trauma may lessen through the repeated act of narrativized processing, let me be clear when I say that this understanding does not follow the medical model. There is no cure for trauma. Healing in trauma studies does not mean erasing traumatic experiences or even attempting to have some sort of psychic return to a pre-traumatic state. Some even avoid the term healing when referring to trauma recovery and instead use remaking. Survivors continually remake who they are post-trauma in ways that are non-linear, non-monolithic, and specifically non-returning. A usual starting question with regards to trauma studies within the biblical field is, can it relate to the Bible's own social historical contexts? When it comes to Esther, we do know some things. It is a post-exilic text, and its story world context, even if some argue it was written in the early Greek period, is Persian. In many respects, the text does seem to be at home in the ancient Iranian world. Susa, where the story takes place, was located at the heart of the Persian Empire and was the central dwelling place for the Persian royal court in winter months. Like those in Israel, such court would have projected an image of piety, suggesting their rule was sanctioned by the gods. This alone tells us something important about the Esther tale. Its lack of divine intervention is not a reflection of Persian influence, but instead a purposeful move on behalf of the author, for reasons we will soon see. It has also long been articulated that Esther's king, Ahasuerus, is a representation of Xerxes I, who reigned in Persia from 486 to 465 BCE. The text, in fact, begins with Esther's Xerxes and his third year of reign, although this may have less to do with specific dating and more to do with an easy setup to lampoon the king and his ostensible reign. A compound of ruling and hero or man in Old Persian, Xerxes means something like ruling over heroes and or men, or hero among rulers. Esther's new to the throne Xerxes does neither, perhaps alluding to authorial dismay or distrust in the Persian imperial enterprise, or perhaps, too, in further evocation of its ancient context, mirror ancient narrations that depict Xerxes. For example, despite situating Esther, or at least most of Esther, within a Persian context, Llewellyn-Jones compares Esther's king with the Xerxes of later Greek constructs, Aeschylus's Persians and Herodotus's histories. Of Persians, Llewellyn-Jones writes, quote, "The great king is characterized as a monstrous but inept tyrant who attempted to crush the freedoms enjoyed by Athens and the Greek city-states," end quote. And of histories, he writes, quote, "Herodotus's Xerxes is a character of intense complexity whose blustering brutality alternates with childlike sulkiness and unexpected, mawkish explosions of tears," end quote. These certainly mirror the characteristics of Esther's king. He is, on the one hand, what his name infers. He rules over 127 provinces, which is more than the actual Persian Empire contained, although the reach of Persia, especially under Xerxes I, was indeed immense. But in reversal of expectation, Ahasuerus is also his own court's fool, incompetence personified. Of course, like the Xerxes of Persians and histories, Ahasuerus of Esther is a literary construct. He's not the real Xerxes or the real anyone. The point of this paper, however, is to question how Esther's representations can still demonstrate how the writer felt about the state of Jewishness and post-exilic Persian diaspora. It is important to note, for example, that third year of reign or not, the story unfolds over a century since Cyrus expanded Persian dominance and brought nearly all Jewish-populated lands under his control. Considering this intertextually with other post-exilic writings, Aaron Kohler makes a compelling observation. Quote, "Despite all the differences between the visions of Ezekiel, 2nd Isaiah, and Zechariah, all these voices from the past spoke as one in assuring the Jews in Persia that their exilic existence was temporary. Their lives, however, screamed the opposite was true. While Jews could remind themselves that the Assyrians had risen to great power and then fallen hard, that the Babylonians, too, had controlled a great empire and then virtually disappeared as a political force, the Persians had already ruled for twice as long as the Assyrians and 3 times as long as the Babylonians," end quote. In Kohler's view, the writer of Esther knew this, and as such created a tale in purposeful opposition to these other expositions. The God of Israel is missing for a reason, as is any allusion to a second Exodus or evocation of Davidic sovereignty. Being Jewish for Esther's author, Kohler insists, was a cultural identity of which to be proud, even a reason for choosing to write in Hebrew, for example, but it was nevertheless an identity that could exist without the, quote, Jerusalem, David, Exodus, God complex, end quote. The Jewish people were now an exilic people, and it was on them to survive and thrive under such circumstances. More can be said, however, for how the text bears witness to the trauma and disruption faced by the Jewish people. By way of background, when reading for trauma, biblical scholars often do so in two interrelated ways. One, they read biblical literature as narrations of and or counter-narrations to communal devastation. And two, they read the literature for signs of distress, either in the author's own reflections or in the portrayal of his characters. Explanations and explorations of trauma, in other words, are rarely flat narrations. Narrative disruptions occur. Evidence of hypervigilance, split thinking, tangential associations, and even dissociations arise throughout. The second reading strategy is not to diagnose biblical characters or the creators, but rather to show how trauma may indeed be a source of the author's constructs. Trauma, after all, can only be trauma if an event or events are felt as such in their afterlife. To put it another way, it is the post-trauma reactions that signal an event or events have been experienced as traumatic. Despite their interconnectedness, Esther is more commonly read with the first reading approach in mind, that is, as a narration of and counter-narration to communal suffering. For example, as I have argued elsewhere, while the Megillah is not a direct recording of historical events, it could nevertheless be offering affective truths that, albeit coded in fiction, still reflect a Jewish communal consciousness. Most scholars agree, for instance, that while Esther reads more like fantasy than history, the Megillah still offers us glimpses into contemporaneous Jewish political self-perception. To use the words of Adele Berlin, the Book of Esther, quote, addresses the inherent problems of a Jewish minority people, their vulnerability to political forces and government edicts, their lack of autonomy, and their dependence on royal favor, end quote. Although Jews in Persia likely did not face annihilation as they do in the text proper, the text's representation of Jews nevertheless subtends a cultural and psychological existence in which Jews are the ethnic other, an existence that, according to some trauma theorists, especially those trained to consider the impact of displacement and empire, can in and of itself rupture the integrity of a Jewish communal consciousness. Esther also, to add to Berlin's claim, addresses the need to respond to such rupture. And I don't just mean through Mordecai's adornment of sackcloth and ashes, a sign of suffering and political demonstration against the Persian norm as it may be. I also mean through the purposeful erasure of the gods. Of the missing God of Israel, for example, I am indeed reminded of the oft-cited Holocaust and post-Holocaust laments. Quote, if there is a God, he will have to beg for my forgiveness, end quote. And quote, if there is Auschwitz, there is no God, end quote. If there is exile, maybe there is no God either. Or at the very least, maybe there is no reason to rely on that God, but instead on the wit and grit of actual people. Esther, in other words, may be offering a fictive narrative that not only captures the real displacement and imperial othering of Jews, but also finds ways to respond and even talk back to such displacement and such othering. The text also narrates the intersectional features of Persian power, person, and gender, and for more than just Jews. The Book of Esther, according to Erica Chandrinka Dunbar, is a book of horror, highlighting the violence and psychological terror of sex trafficking that underpinned the Persian Empire. That women's and other minoritized bodies are made abject, existing only for elite male pleasure, is part of the text's traumatizing legal social structure, evidenced by the result of Vashti's refusal to show herself to the intoxicated king and his intoxicated officers and ministers. It also highlights, Dunbar adds, the very real traumatizing features under colonial subjugation. Not only was the practice of acquiring women as war booty commonplace, but so were governors and scouts conscripting and sending to Persia tribute in the form of castrated boys and attractive and generative, which is to say fertile, girls. In narrativizing this historical reality, Esther also, akin to other horror tales like The Silence of the Lambs or The Shining or Midsummer, narrates and even exploits fear of the unknown and the unexplained. We are never told, for example, what happens to the women who are used and abused by the king for just one night. While we are informed that Vashti's dismissal is what ultimately leads Esther and others to be trafficked in the palace harems, the text is silent on their subsequent fate, including Vashti's. We don't even know if she's kept alive. The audience of Esther is thus left to fill in the blanks with their own imagination, cultivating a sense of dread long after the story's end. Through these unknowns, Ahasuerus is also presented as a proto-Hannibal Lecter, embodying the contradictions of human behavior, in this case, brute and buffoon, in terrifying ways. Esther is more than just horror, however, or a narrativization of imperial-imposed trauma. As alluded to earlier, the Megillah encapsulates an array of comic types and techniques, from hyperbole to irony to slapstick to satire, as if to offer, in addition to Jewish wit and grit, a comic counter-narrative in the face of imperial subjugation. We see evidence of this use of comedy in the same scene as the one explored above. When Vashti refuses to wear a royal diadem for Ahasuerus at his 7-day drinking party, Ahasuerus and his court of bros throw a royal temper tantrum, culminating in the creation of an edict stating that all wives must treat their husbands with respect. The juxtaposition of powerful rulers, typically associated with strength and authority, or at least self-perceived strength and authority, exhibiting such childish behavior not only creates irony, but also showcases the extent to which these rulers fail to recognize the hypocrisy of their actions. While they have no issue inflicting harm or hardship on others, they become emotional when faced with the smallest opposition or disappointment. Their lack of wherewithal is heightened by the fact that, as Selena Spiegel has shown, the king's edict is simply a reiteration of the patriarchy already in place. In other words, Ahasuerus can neither maintain nor retain his own orders. Such focus on Persian incompetency continues throughout the narrative. Whereas traditional slapstick features a duo, with one character being more level-headed and the other being the fool who drives the plot, it is difficult to decipher which character, that of Ahasuerus or Haman, is the text's dumb or dumber. Although not introduced until chapter 3, Haman is presented by Ahasuerus as a man of particular honor. He is given a seat above all the officials who were with him, which inflames Haman's sense of self-importance. As is well noted, however, Haman's exaggerated self-esteem is quickly lampooned as the additional honors he had coveted for himself are bestowed upon his arch-nemesis, Mordecai. Instead of being draped in robes and carried by the king's royal horse, Haman is forced to lead the ceremony in ironic reversal. The bit is then repeated, and heightened, literally, when Haman is impaled on the pole he built for Mordecai. While Haman's elevation to a position of power in 3:1 is indeed maintained, it is also savagely mocked, as he is ultimately elevated 50 cubits high. When read in this way, we can see the text's comic bits connecting to form a grand political satire, a text that paints enemy personages, most notably royal Persians, as royal pains in the ass. In other words, Persian leaders may think they are elite, but in Esther, they are nothing more than foil for plot, farce personified in the face of Jewish wit and survival. Rather than wallow in the repeated diminishment of his exiled minority group, a position perhaps captured in the text's genocidal edict and power plays of the king, the author of Esther combats royal functioning via parodic depictions of Persian rulers. In brief, the author creates a comic counterworld, one in which Persian leaders are chumps, and he and his Jewish counterparts can survive and thrive. Alexiana Fry, however, urges us to consider the second approach in trauma hermeneutics, the cues of trauma and post-traumatic stress within the writing and/or character development, and in doing so, to recognize that Esther's Jews may indeed survive, but not necessarily always thrive. She adds to Dunbar's reading of Esther by showcasing how Esther herself enacts signs of post-traumatic stress. With a trauma-informed lens, she writes, quote, "We are face to face with the literary survival mechanism of fawn," end quote. The fawn response, she adds, is one of hyper-awareness and dissociation combined. One is both, quote, hyper-aware of what is happening around them and also not at all aware of one's internal experience, end quote. In brief, fawners cater to others often over and against the needs of one's own self. This is a common response to trauma, especially by bodies made minoritized, such as a post-exilic Jewish woman living under a non-Jewish patriarchal system. We see this enacted in the text. Esther, for example, as Fry shows, is consistently tov, or pleasing, to not only the king, but also to Mordecai. Quote, her internal radar to her needs has been conditioned to completely shut off in order to become hyper-vigilant to others' needs, especially those who are supposed to care for and meet her needs and have failed to, end quote. Even Esther's request to add an additional day of slaughter in 913 might be to please the king's own interests. In Fry's words, Esther knows that the king, quote, is not opposed to genocide or violence more generally as a way to govern, and thus may, come chapter 9, be thinking to herself, what would best please the king at this time after one day of war? Perhaps more gratuitous death, end quote. Fry also makes clear, though, that we can't really know the reasoning behind Esther's request. The truth of the matter remains that, by the story's end, we don't really know Esther at all. We see no development of her internal sense of self, just consistent hyper-awareness of those around her. She is, as the text reminds us, hidden. Esther is also stuck. Never is she called Hadassah again, and never is she to leave the Persian court, at least not of her own volition. This effectively encapsulates the broader Jewish situation within the narrative, as they too do not escape the Persian system. Even with Esther's access to the royal crown, Jews, like Mordecai, are at the gate. They are actively loyal, yet always already liminal subjects of empire. We see this highlighted at the end of the narrative. While Esther's ending is often presented as the upswing of a comedic U-shaped plotline and that there is a festival to commemorate Jewish redemption, the author makes clear that such festivities do not last forever. Imperial-imposed taxes, he shows, will always resume. To get back to Kohler's point, it seems the author here knows that the effects of exile will never end, at least not fully. A return to Jerusalem is not really a return. A Jew in court is not really a return to Jewish monarchical order. A festival is not really the overturning of all social order. Like the effects of trauma, they can't be. This gets us to the fact that not everyone has read the Jews of Esther as heroes, liminal or otherwise. Its Jewish wit is Jewish trickery, foreshadowing, for example, the perceived danger of 20th century European Jews hiding their race under the guise of their paler skin. Hitler even supported vengeance against the Jews for, in his view, their very much not heroic actions in Esther, asserting that, quote, unless Germany is victorious, Jewry could celebrate the destruction of Europe by a second triumphant Purim festival, end quote. Later, Julius Streicher, seeing himself as carrying into effect the work of not only Hitler but also Martin Luther, shouted Purimfest as he made his way to the gallows. For these anti-Semites, Esther was a manifestation of horror, as were Jews themselves. Yet even those who do not extend anti-Jewish sentiment don't know what to do with the text's excessive ending. Some even want to bifurcate it from the rest of the story. Many scholars argue, for example, that while chapters 1 through 8 may be written in the Persian period, the violence of chapter 9 more rightly mirrors a later time period, perhaps that of the Maccabean era, in which, some say, Jewish violence and physicality were more glorified. As someone who repudiated both Esther alongside 2nd Maccabees, Luther, I think, would agree. In his words, according to Table Talk, quote, I'm so great an enemy to the second book of the Maccabees and to Esther that I wish they had not come to us at all, end quote. While I am in no way suggesting that those who connect Esther to the Maccabean era are speaking from a place of anti-Judaism, I cannot help but wonder if the anti-Jewish interpretations of Esther continue to impact how readers relate to it and its characters. After all, even the hyperbolic deaths resulting from a hyperbolic edict can be read with the same absurdities as the rest of the narrative. When the Jews of Esther perform mass murder, their vengeance is interrupted repeatedly not with descriptions of the fallen, but rather with the bizarre line, but the Jews did not lay hands on the spoil, as if to remind readers that this scene is, indeed, comedy. And as I consistently remind my students, there is no way the use of swords could kill 75,000 plus people in a 2-day sweep. We don't even know how many Jews in the story were fighting. Is it an equal 75,000 plus, or is it 5? In a move of imagination and critical fabulation, I can envision, in the spirit of the iconic Monty Python scene in which the Black Knight and King Arthur duel, a Persian saying, in actual reflection of his predicament, "'Tis but a scratch," and the Jew saying, in ludicrous response, "No, it isn't, you're dead," and then proceeding to count thousands of living Persians as triumphantly deceased. Yes, even the Jews of this tale can be absurd, as evidenced by their skirting of loot. Maybe, in fact, the ending isn't like Inglourious Bastards at all, as noted above, but instead like the offbeat humor of Monty Python cult classics. Or maybe it's both. If the text really is Persian, then the introjection of Persian violence cannot be out of the question. Trauma does not preclude assimilation or hybridity. What then does the full of this paper have to do with Jewish experience in ancient Persia? Maybe nothing, or maybe everything. Trauma has a habit of losing linearity. Its effects attach onto thing after thing after thing, often without clarity or cohesion. It is, if I had to ascribe a third word to it, an experience of excess. Even in trauma narrations, there is no such thing as pure narrative when attempting to speak the unspeakable or to create a counterclaim to systems of oppression. Evidence of stress, hypervigilance, and disconnect still seep through. Similarly, in Esther, there is no such thing as pure horror, just as there is no such thing as pure comedy. While the text may speak to the real terror of being ruled by buffoons with power, something many of us in this room may be feeling in our current moment, thus again unwedging the text from its particular past, it also offers moments of comedic transcendence from such reality. And while the text's comedic elements underscore its social commentary, and may indeed function as a method of survival in Persian diaspora, trauma and the effects of trauma still slip through. The text bleeds so much, in fact, that it can easily become unhinged from the very context this conference urges us to keep in focus. Like its own characters, the life of the Megillah exists within its own liminality. It not only responds to ancient Jewish circumstances, but is also tugged by the uncanny resemblances to, and use for, later Jewish suffering. The trauma repetition in its afterlife is indeed haunting. Esther, put simply, is a book that cannot be contained, and it does not ask to be. It is a book of excess, as is trauma, as is life. Thank you.